Hello everyone, Salam, Namaste, Adab, and welcome to today's event. Today we are remembering Mahatma Gandhi's 70th year after assassination, and his speaker is Professor Irfan Habib, who hardly knows, any introduction is hardly needed for him, but we have asked Professor Ishrat Alam Saab, who is the current chairman and senior professor at Aligarh Muslim University History Department, to give a formal introduction of Professor Irfan Habib. Ishrat Alam Saab.
Professor Irfan Habib Saab, Adab sir, Dr. Raziuddin Saab, Rafat Hussain Saab, Mirza Faisal Beg, and members of Indian Diaspora, Washington, DC. Razi Saab has put me in a very tight situation because it's very difficult to introduce Irfan Saab. Otherwise, also he doesn't need any introduction, as Razi Saab said. But since I have been given this duty, so I would say a few words. Whatever I have learned from my contact with him as a student. What we have learned from him is that the guiding principles of his inquiry is always constant inquiry, self-examination, and defining an extension of Marxist position. These are some of the basic tenets of his history writing, and ever since he published his DPhil dissertation submitted at Oxford in 1963, till to date, because I am saying till to date on the authority of my interaction with him very often. Because of Corona, it has slowed down. Otherwise, we used to meet every day. He has continued to enlighten and inspire generations of historians across the globe, not only in Aligarh, across the globe, with subsequent, profound essays, which we in academic circle call articles, monographs, books on varieties of themes, starting from prehistory up to modern Indian history. And it is difficult to encapsulate, Professor Habib's thoughts, that too in 5 minutes. But the one thing I would like to say is that the totality of his thoughts and contributions can be understood only when someone, one reads his writings in their context and perspectives, because this is something which is never missing in Irfan Saab's writings. He is constantly in ever-expanding dialogue with his sources, and is beyond my humble capacity to say everything in 5 minutes. This is just like traveling the globe in 5 minutes. My goodness, it's very difficult task. But I'm sure the wide curious audience of Washington, Indian Diaspora Washington will endorse my opinion about Irfan Saab, that we are always keen to listen to him. We are to read his writings in order to broaden our understanding of history. With these few words, I hand over the mic to Raziuddin Saab.
Chief, there was hardly any need for me to come back again, so I humbly invite Professor Irfan Habib Saab to please deliver his lecture.
Raziuddin, Professor Ishrat Alam, members of the Indian Diaspora in Washington, friends, after the very kind words about me you have heard from Professor Ishrat Alam, my task has become more burdensome because I'm now called upon to justify, at least partly, his commendations about me. I'm very happy that our compatriots in the United States should be revisiting through this lecture the event 74 years and a week ago when Mahatma Gandhi was assassinated. I feel privileged that you should have chosen me to speak about Mahatma Gandhi at what would be the 75th anniversary of that assassination. I should like first to say that, like millions of Indians at that time, on the next day, 30th, I also joined a vast demonstration, both mourning Mahatma Gandhi's demise and demanding retribution. Of course, time has passed. Very few people must be left now who were present in those demonstrations. And perhaps India has also changed since then. And therefore, it's very important, I think, to remember not only why Mahatma Gandhi was assassinated, but what Gandhi's mission was, and why, at least for a large part of the Indian people at that time, he was for all purposes God. And therefore, since time has passed and human memory is short, it is important to remember a large number of things about Mahatma Gandhi. In the single lecture and perhaps in numerous lectures too, it would not be possible to say everything about Mahatma Gandhi, everything important about Mahatma Gandhi. So I would certainly be selective. And I hope that I would have enough time subsequently to speak about the last phase, which has often been described as his finest hour. And that provoked this assassination. As everybody would know, Mahatma Gandhi was born in Porbandar, a sleeping town in Kathiawar, Gujarat, on 2nd of October, 1869. He, unlike what he says about himself, he was not an ordinary student. He was a very bright student. And he went to England to appear at the bar examination there. He returned from England in 1891. And then in 1893, he went to South Africa as an attorney, the only Indian barrister to be present in South Africa to defend well-to-do Indian clients. His first clients was Dada Abdullah Seth, and in view of the later days, when he was regarded by Muslim League leaders, quite strongly as a Hindu leader. His early clients were mainly Muslim. And when he established the Natal Indian Congress, 90% of them were Bohra Muslims, Gujarati Muslims. In other words, despite having a traditional life in the teens, when he went to South Africa, he began mixing with different kinds of people, particularly Muslims, Gujarat, and then of course also Tamils, people from the Madras presidency who had settled in South Africa, along with Gujaratis and even Pathans who had gone there. So while organizing the Indian community in South Africa to defend their rights, Gandhi had experience of people coming from different parts and also different religions. I'm not going into further detail about his experience in South Africa, but it must be remembered that in South Africa, he was able to organize a movement, ultimately, of which there was no parallel in India. In 1913-14, he organized a passive resistance movement in which large numbers of men and women went from Natal into Transvaal, breaking laws, hundreds of women being involved in the agitation, and then strikes in coal mines, first 3,000 workers and ultimately 30,000 workers on strike, facing all kinds of punishment. Punishment so barbarous that even the British Viceroy in India, Lord Hardinge, protested against the treatment of the strike. And yet ultimately, the racist government of South Africa surrendered and the two demands were conceded. The poll tax of £3 was abolished on Indians and Indian marriages were declared legal. These were the two simple demands. Now, this is characteristic of Gandhi, that with very moderate demands, he could organize a very vast movement. And when Indians look back in 1914 on what had happened in South Africa, they could have well thought that such a thing had never happened in India. There had been no strike involving 30,000 workers, let alone 3,000 workers, let alone 30,000 workers. Women had hardly been involved in such an agitation. So when Gandhi arrived here in 1915, leaving South Africa forever, one would have certainly wondered what he would now do in India. The one thing that might have led to speculation about his ideology at that time was his book Hind Swaraj, written in 1909 in Gujarati and translated by him into English. This book, as a matter of fact, was banned in India, so very few people would have been able to read it. But there are two or three things in this book which are relevant to our book. First of all, Gandhi celebrates poverty. Not the amelioration of poverty so much, as the celebration of poverty is his main concern. He rejects modern developments like railways, modern medicine, modern law. He even celebrates indirectly the caste system because he felt that caste system improved skills and prohibited machinery, excluded machinery. He does not at that time even speak of untouchability or the iniquity of the caste. He sees no iniquities in Indian culture. And therefore, Hind Swaraj is a book which might seem to be a negation of what Gandhi ultimately came to believe and hold for in 1930s and 40s. There is nothing about equality of women, in which he ultimately believed fully. Nothing about suppression of untouchability and uplift of the depressed classes. But there are two or three very important elements in this. Religion is exalted, but all religions. If India was to be, teaching in India was not to be given over to Pandits, but to Maulvis, Pandits, and Parsi Dasturs. So religion was important. Gandhi was not in Hind Swaraj. He is not secular. He is in fact insisting on religion. But not one religion, all religions. The second thing in Hind Swaraj that is important is that he protests against those Indian leaders who were objecting to concessions given to Muslims. He says if Muslims receive concessions, what is the harm in that? They are our younger brothers. This was in reference to the Morley-Minto reforms of 1909, in which for the first time Muslims were provided with separate electors and they could also vote in general electors. So it happened that out of some 28 elected members, they got 11 seats in actual election. So seats quite in excess of their proportion of population. But Gandhi says that Gandhi protests against those who were objecting to this particular favor granted to us. In other words, there's no touch of communalism at all in Gandhi's answer. It would not appeal to a modern reader, but one must remember these two particular things about. And there is a third one also. All books, even nationalist books, used to start with some praise of the British government. If not praise, some acknowledgement of British Crown. Hind Swaraj has no such a movement. It gives no credit to the British government. It nowhere announces any loyalty to the British crown. Clearly, the title Swaraj and this particular critique of British rule throughout, perhaps from a point of view which later on Gandhi abandoned. And then his total abstinence from praising British rule in any way. This showed that Gandhi was different, moderate perhaps in many of his views, but very different from all the other moderates in making no concession to British colonialism. Now, when he came to India, he was certainly marked by two characteristics which made him different from other Indian political leaders. One was his anxiety to be among the poor. And the other was his utter fearlessness as far as the British government was concerned. And third was his, in certain respects, his addiction to principle. There's no criticism of the caste system in Hind Swaraj. But when he established his ashram in Ahmedabad, he broke no untouchability. Even in 1915, when a couple of Dalits, husband and wife, came and joined his ashram, and then there were protests against it, he stood firm. He was even ready to abandon the ashram and shift to a depressed caste locality. But an unnamed saint, by making a gift of a large amount of money, saved the ashram. But already in 1915, therefore, he had come to grips with untouchability and was prepared to make no concessions to it. That was remarkable for a leader of that time. Secondly, his ability to mix with the poorest of the poor. That was shown in the Satyagraha against indigo planters in Bihar, Champaran Satyagraha in 1917, in which he practically lived among the peasants and got simply their complaints to be recorded against the indigo planters. That was something new. And ultimately, both the planters and the government had to surrender, British government. Here, his second ability to stand up when he was asked to leave the Champaran district, he refused. He told the district collector, "I won't leave, whatever punishment you give me." And it was the British government which surrendered, which withdrew then the eviction order. So his ability to stand up, he supported the war, but when he attended a meeting of allied supporters with the Viceroy, he spoke in Hindustani And he demanded the release of the brothers Muhammad Ali and Shaukat Ali. They should be released. He did not care if the government only expected loyalist speeches. He spoke up for the Ali brothers. So this kind of ability to stand up and oppose to the British government was seen for the first time in India from a leader who was otherwise regarded as a martyr. And these qualities continued till the end. Gandhi was self-abasing, modest, but never surrendering to foreign authority. This could be later on seen at many occasions. For instance, when in 1922 he was arrested and brought to trial after the withdrawal of the non-cooperation movement, and charged with sedition. He said, yes, guilty. I'm engaging in sedition, non-violently, in order to overthrow the British government. And it is this kind of courage that actually marked Gandhi. Modesty and combination of modesty and courage. And at all that time, the ability to mix with the poorest of the poor. Several writers, particularly the subaltern school, have objected to the fact that the peasants of the Champaran Satyagraha were rather rich peasants who dealt with the indigo dye planters, although that's not entirely true. That in Khedar Satyagraha only, Pattidars were involved, which were superior kind of peasants. That in Ahmedabad strike, the textile workers were involved who were already employed and were there for the better category of working class. These objections were not valid because these were the people who were entering into struggle. And although an industrial worker may look better placed than an unemployed person, nevertheless, these were the classes to whom no other leader had gone. And Gandhi was ever prepared to go to still lower classes. It was not his fault that those classes, landless laborers and so on, were not yet involved in struggles with the British government or with their employers. As far as he was, he would go to the poorest who were struggling at that time. So therefore, these factors that made Gandhi special leader. He was ready to support even the Khilafat movement, although Khilafat was an issue which only concerned Muslims. But because Muslims felt that the institution of Khilafat, which was then held by the Turkish Sultan, and the English had now defeated Turkey and they were in Constantinople with the Turkish ruler totally under their thumb. So was felt that the holy places would now go in the Muslim holy places would go now under British control. Therefore, there was a revulsion against it and the Khilafat movement came. Gandhi supported the Khilafat movement and actually with his Muslim allies, he built up the first non-cooperation movement, which subsequently owing to Chauri Chaura incident had to be withdrawn. Of course, there would be issue whether Gandhi should have withdrawn it or not, but that's a different matter. Gandhi always stood up for communal unity. In 1924, he went on hunger strike to restore communal unity. He went as far as possible in making all concessions to the Muslim League, both in 1920s and 30s. But unfortunately, one concession made opened the door to further concessions. And ultimately, you came to the 1940 Lahore Resolution, which initiated the movement for partition. Gandhi may have been tactical here and there, but one can see that he was always anxious to make concessions, and where he could not agree with the Muslim leaders, as on the issue of joint electorates, which he favored, he would in practice make the concession. So as far as that area is concerned, it is very difficult to find anything, any fault with Gandhi. I would say the same thing about the depressed classes. A lot of ignorant criticism is made about the Pune Pact of 1930. Sorry, 32. Now, as far as the Pune Pact is concerned, it originated like this, that in the communal award of Prime Minister MacDonald, British Prime Minister in 1932, for the first time, the depressed classes were separated from Hindus and made into a separate constituency. And clearly, instead of proceeding towards a general constituency, now a new step was taken by establishing separate scheduled caste constituency. Gandhi then went on fast against this. And with further, he was in prison at that time because the British had put him in prison and all the Congress leaders, and Congress was banned as an organization and so forth. So Gandhi went on fast, and ultimately an agreement with Ambedkar and another scheduled caste leader was worked out, in which was further later on incorporated in the communal award by MacDonald. It was MacDonald had agreed that if the Indians agreed to something, he would modify the award. Under this, the scheduled caste reservation of seats was doubled, more than doubled, which is not the correct. Even separate electorates for 10 years were allowed. There would be first a scheduled caste election, in which 4 scheduled caste people would be elected for their first war, and then the main election in the general constituency would be among them. So even separate electorate for 10 years was considered. In the MacDonald Award, there was no depressed caste representation in the central legislature. Now 18% seats were reserved for them. Where was then the inequity in this communal award? The depressed caste got more than their seats, more than their population. And they also got that representation of 18% in the central legislature. Throughout, therefore, there was gain. And so that particular amount, which particularly now is all urged against Gandhiji, that he destroyed the political position of the depressed classes, is totally wrong. And then Gandhi then began his great program of Harijan aid, pro-Harijan movement, Harijan Seva movement. And this many Congress workers went to depressed caste villages and communities and worked among them, which is again a very important element in the history of the national movement, which is not given its due. Well, I would now come to what is regarded as Gandhi's finest hour, because particularly today, I think that has a very important message for all of us. For everybody, I think, in the world who faces problem of racism, majoritarianism, religious intolerance, racial intolerance, and so on. How do you fight such a menace? And this, therefore, I come to what has often been called Gandhi's finest hour. That is his last phase in his life. As I've said, Gandhi was much perturbed by the demand for Pakistan and the partition of India. He wanted to give all the possible concessions. It must be remembered that he and Mountbatten, he persuaded Mountbatten to even go to the extent of offering the entire executive power to Mr. Jinnah and the Muslim League for the whole of India, while maintaining the legislative power in the assembly, in the Constituent Assembly, where Congress had a majority. The Congress leadership did not agree. But and Gandhi was much disappointed and then left at that time. Well, I think it was Bihar where he first went. But in the meantime, Gandhi was fighting the whole menace of communal violence. And it is this fight which I think has great lessons for us. Communal rioting began when, for the first time, when on 16th August 1946, Muslim League declared it to be a direct action day. No direct action took place any time in any place in India. But in Calcutta, it took the form of communal riot. Both Hindus and Muslims died in it. And about 2,000 people lost their lives. And then this rioting spread to Noakhali in East Bengal, where Hindu houses were attacked by Muslims and some hundreds of Hindus were killed. It was from Noakhali that Gandhi began his campaign. Characteristic, and unarmed, with his staff supporters, he went to Muslim villages. I mean, the sheer courage of the man, and toured Noakhali. But in the meantime, riots began in Bihar, and about 7,000 Muslims were slaughtered. This was only one-sided slaughter, which now became the form of communal riot, where you have a majority who slaughter the minority. In West Punjab later on, Muslims where they were in majority slaughtered Hindus and Sikhs where they were in majority slaughtered. So Gandhi went to Bihar. And very few people now know that he started a Muslim relief fund because only Muslims were involved. And while Congress had demanded an inquiry to be held, when riots were in Bengal, when Gandhi came to ask the Congress Working Committee to institute such an inquiry in Bihar, and the involvement of Bihar officialdom in the part of Bihar officialdom in the rioting, not only the Congress refused, but ultimately even the Muslim minister who was in charge of relief activity in Bihar was divested of his post because it was thought that too much relief was being given to Muslims. So communalism was now spreading into even Congress ranks. And Sardar Patel had then said at Meerut, the Congress session, sword will be met by sword. Whose sword will be met by whose sword? Gandhi was very greatly perturbed in this declaration. And indeed, one very important Congress leader said to the Meerut meeting that he sometimes felt that he was in the meeting of the Hindu Mahasabha, not the Indian National Congress. So the communal spirit was spreading. But Gandhi would make no concessions. He twice went to Bihar. And when all his attempts to keep India united failed, he wanted even to, as I said, hand over executive power to Jinnah. When the Congress Working Committee simply refused this to countenance it. Then he again went back, I think, to Bihar at that time. And when it seemed that despite his efforts, partition would come along with independence. And then on 14th of August, Pakistan was created, and 15th, India got its independence. Then Gandhi was not there to celebrate it. But he made two statements. First, that both India and Pakistan were his homelands. I think It is a very important declaration of international solidarity. And then he said he was going to Noakhali, which was in Pakistan, to reassure Hindus there. But he could not go there because communal conditions worsened in Calcutta. And it was his stay in Calcutta in August, in early September, that prevented rioting and slaughter of Muslims in Calcutta. Ultimately, in early September, he went on hunger strike, and that made both Hindu and Muslim leaders come to him and assure him that there would be peace. And they were as good as their word, because no further rioting occurred in Calcutta. Here he heard of the massacres in Punjab, but he must have been warned about Delhi, because Patel wanted him to get down at Shahdara station ahead of Delhi. And the reason was that Delhi was now full of violence. And the victims were only Muslims. Terrible things happened, as they happened all over the Punjab and Jammu and Kashmir. In a school in Delhi, when nobody knew that violence would break out and it was in progress, rioters came, separated Hindu children from Muslim children, and slaughtered all the Muslim children. Everywhere from New Delhi to Old Delhi, Muslims were slaughtered. And as I said, Sardar Patel knew, and so Gandhi was made to detain at Shahdara, and Patel brought him to Delhi. And therefore, Gandhi's first duty was, as he saw it, to restore peace in Delhi, and for that time abandoned Punjab. And in Delhi, he did what he had done all his life, to go among the affected and the poorest. He walked barefooted in Muslim camps, which were often placed in mosques. He went among Punjab and Sikh refugees who were in separate camps. Everywhere he was hooted, but he did not mind. He faced everything. He was often abused, but he still went on with his job. This was true leadership. And at that time, very time, in September, October, November, December, Golwalkar also visited Delhi, head of the RSS, who had said in 1938 that only Hindus can be citizens. Non-Hindus will have no rights, let alone citizenship. They are recorded in his We Are Nationhood Defined, 1938. Now he was making speeches, communal speeches, and arousing RSS squads to attack Muslims. This man had the temerity to call upon Gandhiji, and when Gandhiji asked him to declare that Muslims should not be attacked, he refused to do so. Because RSS was throughout involved in the violence, in the terror. Sardar Patel has said that the They were perhaps not involved in the murder of Gandhiji, but they had been involved in the killing of Muslims, men and women and children. That's on record. Patel, whom they often now glorify as a counter to Jawaharlal Nehru, had this, the words that I've quoted are from him. And throughout this period, alone, supported by his close associates, Gandhi went about trying to pacify Hindus and Sikhs, and of course, also trying to look after Hindu and Sikh refugees, along with the Muslim refugees. These people had been treated as Muslims in Delhi had been treated, but they had been treated in West Punjab in the same way. And he had full sympathy with them. He tried to help, and he tried to have volunteers to help them, as indeed he did for the Muslims. And he went to Panipat to prevent Muslims from leaving Panipat. But ultimately he failed, because Muslims did not receive, as they thought, effective assurances from local Hindus and Sikhs. So it was not that Gandhi was everywhere successful, but he tried his best. And certainly his presence in Delhi saved UP, Muslims in UP. Sometime back, I had a German visitor who asked me, how did it happen that communal slaughter took place in Punjab in such a scale, but little happened in UP? Of course, something had happened in Garmukteshwar. About 1,000 Muslims had been killed earlier. But at this time, little happened except Dehradun and Masood. But elsewhere, there was peace. And I told him that perhaps just because of Gandhi, I could think of nothing else. Muslims were as exposed to attack in UP as they were in Delhi. But one man and the respect he had saved peace. So Gandhi's work ought not to be seen only where he only partly succeeded, like Delhi or Haryana, but also in what he totally prevented by just being in Delhi. In the end, I come to the last hunger strike. Gandhi's last hunger strike was provoked by an action of his own government. Refusal to pay 55 crores in rupees worth of sterling to Pakistan. What was due to it under the partition agreement? The Indian cabinet had decided that because of the war in Kashmir, this would not be. The reason was absurd, that if 55 crores were given, Pakistan would arm itself better against India in Kashmir. Gandhi could not accept this total rejection of the wish. This was the first part of strike, a demand on his own government that they should pay 55 crores to Pakistan. This was true internationally. Secondly, it was to bring total peace to Delhi, to vacation of Hindu and Sikh occupation of mosques, to lifting of boycott of Muslim shops and boycott of Muslim workers. The return of Muslims to their houses. These were the three or four major demands for which he went on strike. I was a teenager when, so reading the newspaper at that time, Hindustan Times used to come to our house. I could perhaps face day to day what happened. On the first 4 days, the cry went up in Delhi, Gandhi Murdabad. Processions were taken out in streets and even near Birla House where he stayed at that time, denouncing him. But then the tide turned. And one reason for turning of tide was the response of the people, not only of Delhi, but only of adjacent parts of of Western UP. Everywhere, people wanted to save Gandhi. And therefore, something remarkable happened. Jawaharlal Nehru addressed a crowd of some 10,000 at the Red Fort, from the bastions of the Red Fort of Delhi. This was the first mass meeting against the rioters and in favor of Gandhi. And then from all over West UP, peasants began to come into Delhi. And there was a demonstration of some 1 lakh of people, 3 miles long, in support of Gandhi. Government of India surrendered and paid the amount due to Pakistan. As far as the rioters in Delhi were concerned, their leaders' houses were often surrounded by crowds, and they were practically forced to sign declarations that they would vacate mosques, they would vacate houses, Muslim houses, and so on. All the major RSS and Mundu Mahasabha leaders signed these documents to their own utter humiliation. But they signed it. And when these signs reached Gandhi, when vacation of mosques began, when, as I said, the government paid the amount to Pakistan, when peace was totally established in Delhi, only then Gandhi abandoned his fast on the 18th of January, 1940. Perhaps you might say he signed his death warrant. Gandhi was attacked also previously There was a chap called Lathi Man Thatte. He had a lathi and he used to throw it on Mahatma Gandhi. Whenever his prayer meetings were held, and they were held every late afternoon or evening every day. And I had a view of Lathi Man Thatte himself because for some reason he called on my father, who was a congressman. My mother was greatly annoyed, but my father used to meet all kinds of people, and Lathi Man Thatte, I don't know why he came and called on us, but I also saw that man. He was half mad. But he had been, along with Godse, trying to murder Gandhiji even in 1944. But both of them had been stopped by a police picket who suspected their intentions. And so they could not. They were carrying a knife to attack Gandhi in Wardha. But by chance, a police picket met them and asked them to go away, so they couldn't carry out their mission. So Thatte was not such an innocent person. Already, therefore, his activities attacking Gandhiji's prayer meetings should have awakened the police. Unfortunately enough, secret people were not deployed, and Godse was able to shoot and kill Gandhiji at the prayer meeting as he was going to the prayer meeting on 30th of January. Several questions remained unsolved. Perhaps they were soluble. How did Godse not get money to come twice to Delhi by aeroplane? At that time, it was a very expensive thing. Where did they get the money? Some princely rulers were also suspect. But from some reason, this was either not investigated or the proof never sufficient proof was obtained. But all this is a very dubious proposition. And of course, Savarkar. Savarkar's role in the murder is clear. After all, he was only let off because there was only one witness. But Godse was a constant follower of his from very early time. And Savarkar, like Golwalkar, had never believed in non-violence. So Savarkar was rightly accused. And if perhaps the government had appealed against his acquittal, and the acquittal was not honorable, lack of sufficient proof, then he might have received justice. But the government, I think, thought that now going after Savarkar would be regarded as extra endeavor against him, and therefore they did not appeal against his acquittal. But Savarkar doesn't come clean at all. The man who gave 3 apologies to the British government, the man who created the Hindutva ideology, he created the atmosphere, at least, in which Mahatma Gandhi was born. And it is a misfortune that the admirers of such a man rule India today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Irfan Habib Saab, revisiting Mahatma Gandhi's assassination and remembrance. And now the session is open for question answers. Rafat, Dr. Rafat Hussain is the moderator of this session. If he's available, then we can start this session. Rafat?
Thank you, Razi Bhai. Thank you, Professor Habib and Professor Alam for the insightful talk about the Gandhi and its assassination. So session is open for question and answer. Please raise your digital hand or show your interest in the chat box. So I do have a first question from Rudranshu Singh. Please go ahead, Rudranshu. Unmute yourself.
Sir, I would like to ask you a question that what is the reality behind these two statements that Ambedkar once said that Gandhi cannot be accepted as a Mahatma, even in the moral context, as is often
I beg your
projected
pardon. Could you please repeat your question, Ambedkar?
that Ambedkar once said that Gandhiji cannot be accepted as a Mahatma even in the moral context.
I'm not actually well up in Ambedkar's writings, I should confess. But certainly Ambedkar had no role in the national movement and was critical of Gandhi all the time. Although he had himself signed the Pune Pact, he later on denounced it. And as, of course, well knows, he cooperated with the British government throughout. And while British government took no steps at all in favor of the depressed caste, he still served on the Viceregal Council for 4 years in the 40s. So clearly, there could not be any enmity between Gandhiji and Ambedkar. Gandhi never said anything against Ambedkar, but Ambedkar said a lot of things against him.
So what was the reason behind that, sir? What reason do you think?
I think, you see, partly I think that Ambedkar thought that the British were here to rule all the time. So it is better in depressed caste interest to seek concessions from them. He did not, I think it did not enter into his calculations that India could be free, because that alone explains his acceptance position on the Viceregal Council from around 1943, 42 to 41, I think, to about 45 or 46. So during which period no gain came, no gain to the depressed caste at all. So I wouldn't take Ambedkar's opinion on these matters very seriously.
Thank you, Professor. The next person is Satina Chaudhary, and after that, Prakash. Please go ahead, Satina Chaudhary, sir.
Yeah, first of all, allow me to express my appreciation. I have always had very high regards for Irfan Habib Saab. Now, I want to know about the term scheduled caste. When was it coined, and whether scheduled caste is synonymous with depressed caste. And the second question was with regard to, I've heard that people saying that it was Gandhi's suggestion, on Gandhi's suggestion, that Ambedkar was made chairman of the Constitution. If you know something about it, I don't know anything really authentic. Please let us know. And the third question, the final question, was what was his position with regard to Kashmir? In Kashmir, the conflict started with, I guess, with Pathan's invasion in October 47. On the other hand, Gandhi was killed on January 30 of 48. So there were a couple of months.
No, I've got the point.
Thank you.
What was his position?
Thank you, Chaudhary.
Okay.
So the first thing you wanted was Ambedkar, or what was the first point, sir? As far as Ambedkar is concerned, Gandhi did suggest it.
Scheduled caste.
The new government was to be formed, and he thought that Ambedkar should be invited to be in the government.
Next question. Irfan Saab is
the second thing was about Kashmir. Gandhi supported the Indian position in Kashmir as far as the accession to be followed by plebiscite was concerned. At that time, up to Gandhiji's assassination, the Indian position was that, as in the case of Junagadh, the accession would be then confirmed by a plebiscite. So Indian government had said that although the Raja has acceded to Indian government, there would be a plebiscite held over the matter in Kashmir, as in Junagadh, as was happening in Junagadh. Gandhi agreed, was supporting both these two positions. Kashmir had to be defended from the tribal invaders. The accession had taken place. The accession would be finally confirmed by a plebiscite. And at that time, Sheikh Abdullah was the undisputed leader in Kashmir, and he had been appointed Prime Minister. And subsequently, of course, as you know, a very radical land reform was carried out in Kashmir. And subsequently, the idea of plebiscite was abandoned by the government of India, but not during the time of Gandhiji, when Gandhiji was alive. So that was in relation to Kashmir.
Thank you, Professor. Next person is Prakash, and then Avinash Deer. Prakash Saab.
Okay, sir.
Unmute yourself.
My question. Yes, sir.
Why don't you let him finish the answer? I thought he was going to.
Do you have to add anything, Professor Habib?
I think there was a third question which I forgot.
Oh, it was about
the term scheduled caste. When was it
Scheduled caste.
And
well, I'm not a legal expert, but in the Constitution of India, there was a schedule. So it was used, but I'm not at the moment. I don't remember whether in the Government of India Act 1935 there was a schedule. So this I can't answer at the moment, but certainly in the Constitution of India, there is a reference to the schedule, and the castes are related to that schedule.
But I thought that depressed class.
No, Chaudhary Saab, please. There are a lot of people lined up. Thank you so much. Appreciate. And
I would say depressed caste is not the legal term. Scheduled caste is the term. Legal.
Thank you. So Chaudhary Saab, can I move on now? The next person is Prakash Saab.
Okay, sir. My question to you is, Do you think the narrative built around figures like Gandhiji depends on the political discourse of any specific time? Like whether ideologies related with people like them are politically benefiting or not? And what are the role of historian or academician related with history to keep the truths intact?
Well, you see, as far as history has two parts, one is facts and the second is how you set them in scale of importance. So, considerable amount of methodological refinement has taken place. How you judge sources, how you interpret words, what was the specific meaning of a term at that time. So objectivity is attempted, and it also means that there are gray areas on which nothing can be said, about which no facts are available. And the second thing is what history covers and what aspects of life are more important for the historian than others. On these major schools of historians developed, some historians regard political history as more important, some economic, some intellectual, and there are ways, of course, of their combination. So there is a considerable amount of variety, let us say, as far as the weights you attach to different sectors of life. But as far as factual evidence is concerned, what you have mentioned as truth, there are ways of establishing it. And at least there are ways of saying that this either can't be known or this is very unlikely. For instance, the Aryan race is totally unlikely. Now the official line in India is that we are pure Aryans, and that Aryans went out of India to civilize the world. That is in the syllabus of the University Grants Commission, which all the universities are asked to follow. So it's very much like the Nazi view of the Aryans, except that instead of Germany, we have India. So this thing is not acceptable in any mode of historiography.
Thank you, Professor. The next person is Avnesh, please.
Professor Habib, I just want to know, understanding Gandhi's concept of truth, if he had been advised by archaeologists that there is a structure, a temple structure under the Babri Masjid, what advice would have given to the Muslim community? Should they have given the land? Should he advise them to give the land to the temple, or insisting on fighting?
No, but Gandhiji was not involved in this. He was already dead by the time this controversy.
It's a hypothetical question. If he had been alive.
No, I can't say. I can't say. Okay. I think he would. Everyone can say what his position would have been.
Okay.
Even Sardar Patel protested against what happened to Babri Masjid in 1948. So,
okay, thank you. Okay, next person is Hassan Ghiyas Saab and then Sandeep Mishra. Hassan Saab, please be brief.
Yeah, in the context of the present times, the most powerful antidote to the ideology of God's sake are the thoughts of Mahatma Gandhi. And we can clearly see a strategy afoot to demolish Mahatma Gandhi brick by brick into oblivion. The memory of Gandhi will continue to erode unless there is an organized effort to revive it. My question is, how can such efforts be institutionalized? And what can the role of the Gandhi Peace Foundation be in facilitating the relevance of Mahatma Gandhi in today's times?
I think Mahatma Gandhi's cause was far larger than any institution can handle. It depends really on people. And one of the important things that reactionary regimes do, authoritarian regimes particularly, is to present a totally wrong picture of history, which is now being done, so that the whole national movement is being forgotten. You have just Savarkar there as the great nationalist hero, and sometimes Subhas Bose when you have to have an election in Bengal. Although as far as the Indian National Army was concerned, its total organization and so forth was totally opposed to the kind of ideology RSS follows. And sometimes Bhagat Singh, although against Bhagat Singh was, as well known, a very leftist intellectual. So it had nothing to do with Hindu or Muslim or Sikh communalism. So this is they are trying to drive the main attention away from the mainstream national movement. First the attempt was to set Patel against Nehru. Of course, it is therefore important to point out what Patel has said about RSS. And as I've just said about Babri Masjid. And then set it against Nehru. Another trick is to paint the entire period from 1947 till almost 2014 as in which nothing has happened. No Hindu code. Hindu code came in 1955-56, opposed by Jan Sangh and Hindu Mahasabha. That is quite forgotten. Hindu women got full inheritance rights, all under Nehru. Then Zamindari abolition, then land sealing, so that scheduled castes, the depressed castes, got land for the first time in history, perhaps in Indian history. When we were young, all villagers peasants had mud-walled houses. By 1970s, there were now brick houses. All that change that came with independence is now sought to be covered up as if nothing happened until 2040. So not only the past of India before 47 is being reconstructed, falsified, but even the history of India, experience of India from 1947 onwards is also being falsified. So it's natural that in such a situation, there would be attention moving away from Gandhi and the major national leaders.
Thank you. Sandeep Mishra sir, please be brief.
Hello, sir. So my question is this: like, how Gandhi's Ram Rajya is different from like current ruling government in India's idea of Akhand Bharat or Ram Rajya? Can you please elaborate it?
Actually, when Gandhi used the word Ram, he meant God. He didn't mean the Ram of Ayodhya. He makes it clear again and again in almost words which remind us of Kabir, who similarly clarified his meaning of Ram. So what Gandhi was talking about was God's, and what God would decree to be just, not a repetition of what Ramayan's Ram did in Ayodhya. And that is obvious from his use of the word Ram for God all the time.
Thank you. Mamta Nanda and then Ashish Tripathi. So go ahead, please, Mamta. Mamta Nanda, please unmute yourself.
Can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Good evening, sir. It was a beautiful piece. I have to appreciate, and it is a very informative. My question is from a different chord, keeping the current scenario in my mind. When I think that when it comes to Gandhi, it is very difficult to understand or study him from a neutral positions, because as Indian, we are aware of him since our birth, and he is almost living in our conscience. I just want to know, before your studying of Gandhi, how your idea of Gandhi change or influence your understanding of Gandhi while you study him through documents and events, and how similar and different he is from your previous idea of Gandhi.
I really was not able to follow the question.
Sir, sir, before we study Gandhi, as an Indian, we all know, we have a conviction and idea of Gandhi before we read him. So you also must be having an idea of Gandhi before you read him through documents and event. So I want to know how Gandhi is similar or different from your conviction and the documentation of Gandhi.
She is asking.
Yes.
She's asking that everyone knows about Gandhi since birth. How it is different in documents or same?
Well, I don't know how everyone knows what everyone knows about Gandhi. How would I know? I can only reconstruct Gandhi's life from the document.
Sorry, sir.
Would not know what BC holds about Gandhi. How would I know?
Okay, Mamta, what you want to say?
Sir,
just say in one sentence.
Okay, people who are having similar opinion with Gandhi or differences about Gandhi, they are already having this idea before they read Gandhi. So anything who are opposing of Gandhi, they already know about Gandhi before reading him. So how this conviction can be changed?
So I don't know. As I say, how would I know what they know about Gandhi before reading anything about him? But at the present dispensation, Gandhi is almost sidelined. There's nothing about him in the textbooks also. Now the other people are being put forward. People like Savarkar, as if they were the main leaders of the national movement. So there's less and less about Gandhiji in the present official publications, particularly when the new NCERT publications come. I think this would be obvious. But when the NCERT under Vajpayee government issued Hari Om's textbook on modern India, then you can see that Gandhi's role was greatly reduced. His assassination was not mentioned, as if that is not an important event in India. So obviously, there is an official attempt to sideline not only Gandhi, but the entire national movement.
Okay, thank you. And there are a couple of questions lined up. Professor Habib, how long do you want to stay? Because there are 5 more questions.
Rafat,
Is that okay?
Rafat, you ask Ashish first. You already named Ashish Tripathi first.
Yes, I know, but I'm saying there are 5 more people lined up.
Okay.
I just wanted to know from Professor Habib how long he wanted to stay.
I'm all right, but it depends on what time you have for this session.
Okay, thank you. Ashish Tripathi sir, please be brief.
Thank you, Rajiv bhai. Thank you, Rafat sir. Good evening, sir. Sir, even in Gandhi's time, a lot of his disciples and other freedom fighters had differences over his opinion or his practice of satyagraha and non-violence. But 74 years after his death, we see that across the world, using this form of satyagraha, many people have been able to get their rights. So can now we say that this is the greatest contribution of Gandhi to the world, to the humanity?
Well, actually, Satyagraha to him was a non-violent struggle. And it cannot be said as a historical fact that non-violent struggles alone have changed humanity. Sometimes armed revolutions have changed it. French Revolution, for instance, established national states, democracy, gave land to peasants, but that was a violent revolution. So it cannot be said that in history, the major role has been played by non-violent satyagraha or non-violent movements. But yes, they are becoming important as a mode of agitation, and much of that importance goes back to Gandhiji, because it looks as if non-violent agitations or movements could be more successful in some cases than violent. As Gandhi said that if you have violence, then you establish injustice, and then there will be a counter move. Whereas when you have a non-violent satyagraha, you injure no one.
Thank you. Sanjesh Kumar sir, and then Hifzur Rahman Siddiqui. Sanjesh, please unmute.
So my question is, in your closing remarks, you mentioned that the admirers of assassins of Gandhi are today the rulers of the country. But these same so-called rulers don't leave a chance to gain mileage on name of Gandhi at international meets and events. So my question is, do these rulers truly appreciate Gandhi or just use his name on international platforms for own immediate personal interest?
No, I'm not familiar with what the present government does in international platforms. I'm not familiar with them. But certainly internally, they raise the question again that how he can be father of the nation through local leaders and so on. They have this query. Kalyan Singh raised it first. The late Kalyan Singh, once chief minister of UP, he said that Indian nation is as old as the Vedas. How can Gandhi be the father of the nation? So they have put a question mark there. And certainly as they rewrite history or they write fiction instead of history, they will certainly try to reduce the importance of Gandhi's role in the national movement. Indeed, put the national movement very low in their account.
Thank you, Professor. Pratap Behra sahab. Oh, sorry, Hifzur Siddiqui.
Yes, sir. My question is a simple question. Means whatever we are observing in our present India, whether this Godseism is a reality or it's just a political fantasy, sir. Godseism.
No, I don't know what Godseism is because he was a
It's
follower
so-called
of
Godse's march.
he was a follower of Savarkar, and Savarkar is the author of the Hindutva doctrine and the two-nation theory. Actually, his two-nation theory came 2 years before the Lahore resolution of the Muslim League. So it is that theory that is going round. And then after propounding the two-nation theory, then Savarkar said, of course, that the Muslims will have to be put down. So there is always, at the end of it, one-nation theory. So I think that is coming to pass, as our very priestly Chief Minister of Uttar Pradesh said, it's an issue between 80% and 20%, Muslims in UP being 19% of the population. So clearly, we have got a majoritarian regime coming.
Thank you. Pratap Behra sir.
Sir, namaskar. I feel very fortunate to hear you, listen to you second time in this platform. Sir, I have a very small, question. I want to get your remark. Sir, Gandhi wrote Hind Swaraj 1909, and after that he lived up to about 40 years only. So my question is that how much of his vision is achieved and how much it is unfinished, and the second thing that I would like to know from you as a remark is Hind Swaraj still relevant, or is it going to be dumped?
Which one? Which event?
Hind Swaraj.
Hind Swaraj. Well, actually, Gandhi himself wrote that in Hind Swaraj, he said many things which he now did not hold. Many things he had given up. He said that in around 1930. He basically thought that that Hind Swaraj, not the details, but the main outlook was the same as he was now holding. But one would differ. For instance, in Hind Swaraj, women were to only live within the house. They ought not to go out. They should not be factory workers. But it was Gandhi who sent them out to villages in 1920s. It was Gandhi who said that they should be not only soldiers, but generals in the army. In 1945 or 46, he said to a correspondent that men as generals would be very cruel, so women should be generals. He was not prepared to concede anything as far as women were concerned. Then the caste system, he first opposed untouchability, and he said, I'm not asking for interdining, but ultimately he said, I won't attend any marriage unless one of the parties to the marriage is a Harijan. Only then I would attend a marriage. So he was now propounding a philosophy of intercaste marriage. So Gandhiji's views, I think, turned more and more radical as time passed. And how much of Hind Swaraj remains? Gandhi thought much of it remained. I am too small a man to argue with Gandhiji, but I think that very little remained of Hind Swaraj in the mature Gandhi of 1940s.
Thank you. And the last person is Yusra. Please go ahead. Yusra, please unmute yourself.
Adab, Professor Habib, and everyone who is present here. I have two questions. One, I wanted to ask that are we as Gandhians, there's like a whole campaign to rewrite history. So are we as Gandhians, do we selectively read history? Are we also selectively reading history when we study or read about Gandhiji or Nehru or their role in history? Because when we talk about rewriting history, there's always this confusion. Are what we reading is the correct history? So what do you think about that? And secondly, the second shorter question is, since Gandhiji was also not an infallible, I want to know from you, what do you think his gravest failing was?
Yusra, you asked my question. The shorter.
We've just helped with the time crunch then.
What was your first question? Sorry,
My
what was your
first
first
question was, are we as Gandhians selectively reading history when we do references? Are we giving him the benefit of doubt? Because there's a whole campaign of the victor writing the history and the rewriting of history that is happening currently.
Because there is no victor in Gandhi. So this victor and victim issue doesn't arise there.
So
one can only say that the literature on Gandhi is very vast. All his collected works have been printed, all collected documents, and they are more than 100 volumes. They have shown no discrimination, no selection. They have printed everything that Gandhi ever wrote and which has survived. So naturally one has to select, and part of history writing is selection. You can't have all the facts, you have to select. So selection is necessary all the time. You can argue that the selection is not proper, or you have only selected things that are favorable to Gandhi, and you have now abandoned things which are unfavorable. But I think in the case of Gandhi, that is not the case. One always notes the insufficiencies in the deficiencies in Hind Swaraj, both in actual statement and in what he is arguing. And as he himself said, I rejected many things. For instance, he confessed that when he was writing Hind Swaraj, he didn't know the difference between the spinning wheel and the loom, charkha and karga. So clearly, one doesn't accept everything that Gandhi said at the time, and history means that you have to have selection. You just can't reproduce. If you are writing about Gandhi, you can't reproduce 101 volumes. You have to select. So selection is necessary. Only it should be proper selection. That is all. Taking all sides.
So, Professor Ravi, please allow me to continue ask the same question what Yusra asked. So, we all know that Gandhi is revered all over the world as a great leader. So, historically speaking, because as he was a human being, what would have been his biggest blunder during the freedom movement or his lifetime, if there is any?
Well, you see, it's not that nobody contested or can't contest Gandhi's decisions. For instance, on Quit India itself, Nehru and Abul Kalam Azad, who was then president of the Congress, were greatly perturbed. And it was only because Gandhi had the majority of the working committee, and he threatened both of them for expulsion from the working committee, that they actually fell in line. And even today it can be argued that from a very narrow point of view, it might have been thought that since Japan had come up to Burma and the Germans were on the Volga, and Americans and England and British were in retreat everywhere. Americans had lost Philippines and Britain was in retreat had lost not only Burma but was in retreat in Libya, in Egypt. So it was the time to demand independence from Britain when it was the weakest. To Nehru and Azad and to communists, it looked as this was the time when you shouldn't do it, because you could then be helping the fascist cause, the Japanese cause and the Nazi cause. So clearly Gandhi's decision was for quit India cannot be justified today. And in any case, the Soviet victory at Stalingrad meant that England had no particular reason to feel weak then, because the Russians had defeated Hitler and it was a matter of time now for Hitler to be destroyed. So even tactically, Quit India movement proved to be based on wrong premises.
Okay, that concludes the question and answer session. I am sorry there was one more demand for a question, but as I already said, this will be the last question. And over to Razi Bhai. Thank you, Professor Habib, for your time.
So many questions were asked, Professor Irfan Habib Sahab. I also want to ask a brief question. My question is not for history, rather, what would you prescribe as a model for today's struggle? Like what is going on in India? If we are as a diaspora, as well as those who are struggling against this present Hindutva onslaught, what could be in the light of Gandhi, in the light of Gandhian experience, what could be a workable model, effective enough to do something?
Well, clearly, as it's been clear from what I've been speaking on Gandhi, the present situation is very adverse to democracy and to scientific temper, as for instance, Jawaharlal would have defined it, and to rational behavior. And certainly minorities are in considerable danger today, to an extent which could not be imagined earlier. And internationally, because of the conflict between the United States and its allies on the one hand and China and Russia on the other, Indian government can get away with many things in which the so-called international opinion counts, because obviously India is India is a large country, and whatever its government is particularly favored by United States and its allies. So internationally also things are difficult for rational and secular forces in India. But it is for the Indian people and the secular forces in India to stand up. They can't be propped up by international opinion. It is our own business. So although the international situation is unfavorable to rational approaches in India and very favorable to the BJP and the present dispensation, I think the fight will have to go on.
All right. Yeah, the fight has to go on. Only the prescription is missing. What could be the most effective way to proceed?
There can't be any prescription. Much depends on what the other party does.
Well, perhaps people are doing, a lot of groups are even making alliance.
Well, that is, of course, the situation in democracies, particularly in democracies where proportional representation system does not prevail. If proportional representation system as prevailing in many countries like Germany and so on had prevailed, then the political situation would not have been very unfavorable. But under the Anglo-American system, where one person passed the post, this is very helpful to authoritarian regimes once they seize majority.
Yes.
As in fact was the case with the Nazi regime. Nazis would never have been able to govern Germany if it had been a case of proportional representation. But anyway, we have to battle in a situation where it is. Yeah. For the moment, the opposition parties do not unite. So that is also creates a difficult situation.
Thank you. Well, so it has been almost 2 hours. You must be feeling a little tired. So let's end it here. And thank you again. Thank you, Ishad Saab also, and all the audience present.